Hey, welcome to another episode of All the Remote Things, and I'm here with Lisette Sutherland. How are you today?
It's early in the morning for me today, so if my voice sounds like you're the first person I've spoken to, it's true.
I
But
woke
in
you
general, good.
up. Hey, brilliant. Look, one of the things we do here is, would you like to introduce yourself, Lisette?
Oh man, yeah, sure. Let's see. I've run collaboration superpowers for the last 10 years. So I think that's the big thing to introduce where we've been trying to not push the remote agenda, but I've been excited about being remote for a really long time. So yeah, I think that's the best way to introduce. I mean, I've got a podcast and a book and all that stuff, but if people just go to the website, they'll find all of that, all the good stuff.
Fantastic. And we're going to chat about that anyway. So that's that's fantastic. And we were just talking before off air, as we do. We know a lot of different people, but we've missed each other like in the night. But I first really discovered your work when I was working on some distributed programs, as we would call them in those days, rather than remote or hybrid. And you produced a pack of cards, which I looked at and went, yeah, that is so good. Which was visual meeting cards, and I think maybe a lot of people don't realise that you did that, or maybe it's sort of a little bit back from that. But yeah, talk to us a little bit about where that came from, and I know you've got a pack there, so feel free to flash a few up.
Oh yeah, I'll show because I want to show some of my favorite ones. They've evolved over the years, which is really fun. I mean, we've have several different versions out. Um, but really they evolved because I kept writing sticky notes to people that I was, in the beginning, video conferencing was a little bit more tricky. People hadn't used Zoom before, and so you were constantly trying to tell them where the microphone settings were or what was going on. Like, I can't hear you, or I can see that you're on mute, and they couldn't hear me. And so the cards, like the visual way of communicating with each other, was sort of necessary in the very beginning. And now it's mostly fun. So there's a bunch of, there's the old cards, like the you're on mute card. That's the standard classic. Everybody's got that one, right? Yeah, so that's
It's
good.
saying
But
2020 to 21, 2022, and still.
yeah, and still, right? Like, I still do it. But we have like useful things like, oh, should we record this meeting? I can see the green screen's getting away there. But some of the ones that have come up now is this one: since the pandemic, what's that behind you?
Oh
Because
wow,
everybody's always asking, like, oh, what is that behind you? And then this one is, I always think, is really funny, which is like, no, you go first. So
brilliant.
there's just some humor in it. So, we developed some of them to be super useful. And then the latest version, I actually reached out to the community and said, what cards are we missing? Like, we're going to redo the deck because since the pandemic hit, remote work evolved so fast. And some of the cards that we had in the past just weren't relevant anymore. So I reached out to the community, and the latest deck is called the Community Edition. And we just basically got the best suggestions from all the remote people out there for the newest deck. So it's really fun. It includes more cards like asynchronous things and should we check in with each other. Yeah, just a little bit more involved. And Elmo, actually, my favorite card, Elmo. Enough, let's move on. For all you talkers out there, I've been Elmo more than anybody, but we softened it to say Gelmo now. So it's
Oh, I
good
like
enough, let's move on. So you can have the harsh version or you can have the softer version.
that's brilliant. Yeah, we were talking about that previous as well. Elmo was the first one I sort of started using, so I love that. That's fantastic. And I think that's the sense of fun that you bring to the remote working. The collaboration superpowers is definitely the reason I wanted to talk to you today, because you finally sort of put pen to paper or keyboard to keyboard to document, and wrote a book around it as well. So work together anywhere. How did it come about? Why did you write it, so to speak? And then let's talk a little bit about what it includes.
I mean, honestly, in the very beginning, it came about because I was looking for work. And I thought that if I interviewed people, that it would be a great way to network and to maybe find a company that I wanted to work for. And I was working for some online project management tools at the time, but I complicated my life by moving to the Netherlands. And the visa that I had was because I was a solopreneur and that I had my own company. So that was the visa restriction. So I was very limited in the kind of job that I could get, right? It had to be somebody that would be able to hire me with my visa restriction. So in the beginning, I started searching. And then as I started talking to people about how they were working remotely, the stories just got more and more interesting. And of course, I started developing from all the stories because I was working with Jürgen Appelow at the time. Well, it's all sort of overlap, but I came in contact with Jürgen Appelow, and Happy Melly happened, and I started really finding my groove in that. And so then instead of looking for work, I was really curious about what people were doing. And so the workshop developed from that because Jürgen had a workshop. And so people in his community were asking me for a workshop. And then the podcast developed because somebody said, like, hey, I can't consume. I was just doing written interviews. Like I would interview people and then type up all the interviews. And then people said, like, oh, I can't really read the full interview. I really want to listen to something. And I thought, oh, I should do a podcast. So, I went on Upwork and I found the podcast monster, my producer. And, from there, sort of the rest is history. But it started because I was looking for a job and I was trying to interview people. And it's interesting because you can say to people, I'm writing a book. I'd love to interview you for my book. But in the beginning, I had no intention of writing a book. It was just sort of a way to tell people, like, oh, I'd like to interview you for something important, this theoretical book. But over time, people started asking for the book. I started getting emails from people saying, like, hey, this book is something that I actually need. And I thought, oh my God, I really have to actually write this book now. so that, I then set out to write the book. And I have to say, it was the hardest thing I've ever done. People keep asking if there's going to be another book, and there will not be another book. Like I had this romantic vision of what a writer was. Like I was going to drink cappuccinos in my wood cabin, and write a book somewhere. Like I just had this like romantic fantasy about what writing a book was, because Jürgen made it look so easy, but it was not easy. It was not easy.
Yeah,
but it's done now.
As someone who's in the process of doing so, if you're not a natural writer, it's a very hard thing to take from what's in your head and put it into the end of a page. So I take my hat off to you.
Yeah, I mean, you have to write there's got to be a red thread throughout the story, and you have to tie the beginning to the end. And I just had all these random interviews, and like, how do I make a story out of that? Thankfully, I mean, you'll see on the book that I have a co-author, Kirsten Janine Nelson, and thankfully she is a friend of mine from San Francisco that we've been friends for 25 years now. And I knew she ran a publishing company. And so I contacted her when I was really struggling and needed to get it done. I contacted her and said, I really need help. And since she knew me so well, it was just an easy collaboration, right? I mean, we didn't even talk on the phone during the whole time we wrote together. It was 100% asynchronous communication. I think that it was possible because we were such good friends to begin with, and she is such a good writer by nature. So, but it was an interesting collaboration in that way.
No, that's interesting to hear that it was done async, because that's not an easy thing to do either. But you do want to try and do as much of that when you're working remote as well, cut down that cognitive load. Here's a question for you though. So let's talk about what it actually contains a little bit. And I've read it, so that's okay. But a lot of people won't have heard about what it's got in it. Talk to us a little bit about what the book contains and why people would want to read it.
Well, I would say that the beginning starts out with the lay of the land, but then it quickly, and I would say at the moment, since the pandemic, it's kind of outdated in that way. I mean, it's interesting to see the history. So I would say skip chapters 1 and 2 and go straight into the next chapter, which talks about like, what do we need as individuals to work remotely? So it's got 3 different perspectives, because initially we were building it for the people who were wary of working remote. Like, so it's really built for the person who was like, I'm not sure if this is for me, or I'm not sure if this is for my team. And so we came at it from like the skeptic's perspective. So the beginning really starts from, what do you need as an individual? What should you be thinking about if you want to go remote? Of course, the pandemic changed all of that, but still, I think the questions still hold. Like if because it's not for everybody. I'm constantly reminded of this because my husband hates working from home, absolutely hates it. And so I understand that it's not for everybody. Like I see it every day, but so from an individual perspective, and then we start going from the team perspective. What do you need to actually collaborate together as a team online? And then it comes at the end of the book, it goes to the leader's perspective. What does it mean to actually lead a remote team? And what do you have to think about as a leader? Because it's very different than in person. Right? The things that we want from our leader in person is different than the things that we want remote. In person, leaders can lead with their charisma and their personalities, and we can inspire people through our inspiring talks. That falls pretty flat when you go remote. So leaders, what people want from their leaders is being more organized, being more dependable, setting up a good workflow system, right? Like we want the workers to do the work, but the leaders should be in charge of setting up the system of work and the way that the work flows between people. And so there's just a different set of skills needed now for the remote leadership world. So basically, that's a really long description, but basically what I did is I took all of the interviews that I had done until the book was published, and I took all of the advice and the tips out. I literally I printed the transcripts and then highlighted all the good tips from and then I cut out the good tips, and then I kind of rearranged it on my floor, and I built the book out of the tips from others. So it's not me as an expert in any way. It's really, I interviewed all of these experts, and here's what I found. And that's sort of the basis of the book. So it's filled with tons of quotes and tips from other people.
Yeah, we were talking about it, and I think one of the things I like about the book is the sense of fun through the book as well. Like we were talking again off air, and as we do, and we were talking about how the sense of fun. Like for example, the name Remote AF, and everybody says, "Do you know?" And we say, "Yes, we do." It made us laugh, but the irreverence of it was meant because we want to have a bit of a brightness, a bit of that joviality built into this remote working, and you definitely. Agree with that. Did you set out to write that through the book in that way, or is it just how it came together? Or
Well, I think, yeah, it is, I didn't set out to do it, but it is a real, it's an important component of my own personality in that, for me, who I work with is more important than what I'm working on. And having fun and really enjoying my work is critically important for me. Like if I'm not enjoying what I'm doing, it's impossible for me to get the work done. I mean, there's always things you don't enjoy in any job that you have. Like I hate the financing, right? So there's just some things that you have to do. So I'm not saying every component of the job needs to be fun, but in the beginning, I was a little bit wary of it, but it just sort of came out naturally. And now what I find is most of my clients come to me because of the playful nature of the brand and the cards and I mean, it's just, we can all take our jobs too seriously, but I think most people recognize that the fun and the playfulness is really that's sort of the magic on a team, right? When you enjoy working with each other and you've got each other's back, you can do anything. Like when the team is really having fun together, you can do anything. So it doesn't mean that we have to do pizza parties or quiz nights or anything, but that we feel safe enough to infuse our own personalities and bring our full selves to work, I think is the message I'm trying to get across there. And that's not always possible.
yeah, and I think that's because we got thrown into this, right? Generally, we know that COVID was sort of the lightning rod, but let's be honest, it was happening before that, and there's fires and pestilence and floods and things like that caused all of us to do that. But even then, there were big programs and big projects and distribution, and the technology's come a long way to help us. But we really didn't think about the context of having the fun while we were doing the work, and it can get too serious, and then the cognitive load tends to burn you out as well. And that's what I love about some of the things that you put together there is that, even just by holding up Gelmo, for example, all of a sudden people go, whoa, and it creates that sort of moment.
Yeah, indeed. And one of the things that we saw in the beginning of COVID, I thought was really interesting, was that people were trying all kinds of things online, right? Board games, museum tours, virtual DJ parties, like the fun came out immediately when we went into lockdown. And I think that was one of the, eye-opening things for most people out there is the variety of things that you could do within these 4 virtual walls. And I think that's also part of the reason why the cards were developed, because it was a means of saying, like, we don't have to just talk. There's visual things that we can use as well to help each other work, right? And that's also one of the things that's come out with remote working is the use of virtual whiteboards and the concept of visualizing our ideas and visualizing our work together and brainstorming in new ways. So that's sort of, the cards sort of inspire that way of thinking.
Yeah. So I want to take you a little sideways on the journey and ask you a question around where you think it's headed now. And when I mean, where do I think it's headed? So, the Agile community is for a very long time coalesced around face-to-face collaboration, getting people in the same room in the same place, same time. And of course, this is not going away, this remote hybrid journey now, because people have had a taste of it. I'm sure the pandemic hasn't quite disappeared, touch wood, but those sorts of things. Where do you see the Agile community going with this and remote and hybrid in itself?
The simple answer is the way that I see the future is that the future of work is choice. It's choice for the individual to work when and where they're most productive. And it's, of course, choice for companies to decide how remote they want to be. There are some company cultures, for whatever reason, that just work better together in person. And I feel like that's great. If that's your culture, like my husband's company, they just prefer in person, even though they can do it remote. Every once in a while they stay home, but they just generally prefer that. And I think, great, more power to them. And I feel like companies should also have that choice. I mean, Netflix is famously doing it, Goldman Sachs, although they called people back to the office and only 50% showed up on the first day. So we'll see how that goes. But really, I do think the future of work is choice. And it's one, choice for our own productivity, but also life gets in the way of getting to the office, right? Like bad transportation, sick kids at home, bad weather, fires, like, all kinds of plagues and, all the things that get thrown at us. And so I think regardless of where people are on the scale of remote and hybrid, every company can benefit from having remote first practices in place in case something happens. And I've been saying that for years. I mean, if you go back to old talks from 2016, I kept saying to people, you don't have to go remote, but you should at least have the processes and the systems in place, because no matter what, it will always help you. And then came COVID. And it was just like, okay, now we have to do it all overnight. And I always said, it was funny, I always said to people, like, you don't want to do this overnight. Like, that's the last thing you want to do. Like, do an afternoon a week or do one day per week where everybody's at home. And then, of course, COVID blew all of that out of the water. But to get back to the actual answer of your question, I do think that the future of work is choice. We are experts of our own productivity and experts of our own lives. And I think people know what they need to get the work done. And we should give them the freedom to do that.
Yeah, so if we take that and take the Agile frame on that, so expand on that a little bit, how does Agile work then? How do you see Agile working? Because you've been doing this for some time. You've traversed the different organizations. We still want to work in an Agile way because it allows us to adapt and pivot, as we know, and all the good things that it brings. But now that we're working in remote, it's an interesting, or even better, remote/hybrid. How do you see that working now?
I mean, it's interesting because in the manifesto, when you go back, I think it was 2011 it was written. It was, or 2001 or 2000, yeah, 2001. So okay, so even longer, right? And it has the very specific face-to-face language in it. And I've always thought, actually, we should just change it to e-face to e-face. Like, yes, it's best if we can be together in person. Of course, we're all in the same place at the same time, doing the same thing together. But the reality has always gotten in the way. So I think now, I'm not an Agile expert, so I'm not going to pretend at all to be that. I'm for sure not an Agile expert, but I've always just thought, like, yeah, what if we could collaborate e-face to e-face? And in 2001, the technology was just not there, but now there's an app for everything. So there's really no excuse anymore. And I just really feel like with the technology that we have, the Agile way of working, I just don't see it in being an impediment anymore, being e-face to e-face, just given how easy it is to connect and to collaborate, and the virtual whiteboards and the way that we visualize our work, and the, Trello and Jira and Confluence and all the things that we have. It's almost just a matter of redesigning our systems and processes. But I don't see how I've never really understood how it got in the way of being Agile to begin with. It was harder because of the technology before, but now with the technology, I just don't see how it changes anything, to be honest with you. Like, we're not in the same place at the same time, so it's a little bit harder, but we've got all the technology to be able to connect. I mean, you and I, you're in Australia and I'm in the Netherlands.
Yes.
Kind of amazing. So like your Wednesday is already passed. I'm just starting the Wednesday. You've said it's going to be a busy day. So I'm prepared for that now. But like it's kind of amazing what's possible now. I have a workshop later today and I have people from 11 different countries coming to that workshop. I just think that's awesome. So yeah, I don't know where Agile is going. It's, I'm just not an expert enough, but I just don't see how remote is an excuse for not being agile anymore. I just don't understand how it's still an excuse.
Yeah, no, I heartily agree with you. But yeah, there's no disagreement for me. It was an interesting because obviously remote effort revolves around that thought as well. Is that in fact, it doesn't matter what kind of work you're doing, whether it is using agile or traditional or whatever it may be. There's no excuse for not designing to work properly in remote or hybrid.
It's just a different workflow. I always make the analogy with radio and television, right? They're both broadcasting mediums, but you would design content for radio very differently than you design it for television. So I feel like the same is true for in-person and remote. We just have to redesign how the work flows using a different methodology, like different tools, but it's the same principles. The principles stay the same. It's just the workflow that changes.
Yeah, that's for sure. So let's chat about let's take another turn and let's chat about your podcast. So talk to me a little bit about the podcast that's ongoing. What's the premise of the podcast? How can people get involved with that podcast?
So the premise is remote teams doing great things together, because that was always sort of the inspiration for me starting with remote to begin with. Is I actually worked 20 years ago in Los Angeles. I worked for a company that was building an online project management tool. And at the time, it was a new thing. Like Basecamp had just started, Zoho was still on the market. Like it was really just the beginning. And so um, for me, it was just an interesting project, but it was the reason why this tool was being built to begin with. And it was because the CEO of the company, he didn't want to die. And he thought that he could get longevity scientists working together and collaborating from all over the world and sharing data so he could solve the problem of aging. So he really genuinely didn't want to die. And so he was using this platform. He was building this because he knew that there were longevity scientists working on this problem of aging all over the world. And they just weren't sharing their data because they didn't know about each other. So he wanted to build this online platform for them so that they could solve aging. And my mind was so blown when he was explaining the concept to me that I thought, that's awesome. What else could we do if we didn't have location in the way? And so I started, I was looking for work, but I was also genuinely interested in what else are teams doing to what other great things are we doing out there when location's not in the way? And man, I found some amazing things. Like one of my interviews was with NASA right in the beginning. That was awesome. And all of a sudden we're talking about time zone differences, but not on Earth, like the time zone difference between working on Mars and communicating back to Earth. And I was like, wow, like, I can't believe we're talking about this. Like, this is for real. And then I interviewed like Hyperloop. Hyperloop is a team that they entered the SpaceX competition to build the Hyperloop, which is this super fast transportation system where you're basically getting shot through a gravity tube, another Elon Musk project. But one guy was interested and he just put out in a subforum of Reddit, is anybody else interested in joining this project? And within a year, they had 400 remote volunteers from all over the world. And they came in finalists in the competition. So as I started interviewing teams, I was seeing like, man, people are doing some amazing things together. And it was just proving that we could work on big, complicated projects from a distance. And the Hyperloop thing was all mind blowing because they were all volunteers. It wasn't even a company where they were getting paid. It was just like a group of people wanting to do this. So the podcast started just because I wanted to hear, like, what are the other things that people are doing? And then it grew from there. And now it's really, we're almost coming up on episode 300 now, which is kind of amazing. And I continue to do it because I always learn something when I'm talking to somebody in an interview. And so for me, because people are coming to me for all the latest trends and what is happening with remote, like for me, it's really the best way to keep my feet on the ground, because you can get really theoretical about stuff. And that's sort of where I sit, right? Like I'm not a practitioner. I'm not actually in a company coaching them through their process of going hybrid. I'm collecting all of the best practices. and then feeding the principles back to the public. That's sort of my role, right? I'm collecting all the stories, and then I'm saying like, okay, I'm seeing all these stories. Here are the general principles that I'm seeing come out from all of these stories. So it just keeps me honest and real. So I continue to do it because, well, I love talking to people and interviewing them, but it also really it keeps me current on what's happening.
That's why it's so great to get you on the other side of the mic. So I got to
Yeah, it's weird to be interviewed. Yeah.
it's always a different feeling, isn't it? Look, we're very close to the end of our time. So look, fantastic to have you on here. I'll be really excited to get you on all the remote things. So thank you for spending that time. But how can people get involved? How can they get on the podcast? How can they find out what you're doing? How can they look at the workshops that you're doing?
Well, I'd say if you're on a remote team doing great things, or if your team is transitioning from being remote during the pandemic to this hybrid, then definitely get in touch about being on the podcast. We've got a form on the website where, you can fill out your story, and we're really just looking for people. This year, I'm focused on people who are doing the transition because everybody's struggling with going to hybrid. I mean, being all remote is one thing, but like going hybrid,
Yes.
it's a whole other ballgame, a whole new medium. And what I would say for people who are thinking like, yeah, what else could I possibly learn? Like I've been remote for 2 years now, and I would say really join one of the workshops. I promise you, you will learn something new because one, they're fun, they're really interactive. You're going to be in a workshop with people from 10 other countries, going through the same thing that you are. And so it's really a facilitated conversation between other people that are doing this. And the goal of the workshop is to really bring out all of the virtual expertise in the room. So I'm laying down the general principles, but you're hearing the experience from tons of other companies and people of all different kinds, like big corporations to solopreneurs to digital nomads, right? So it's really, it's an interesting experience, I would say, to go through a workshop. So if you're really doubting, I would say you don't know how much pain you're in, and come check out a workshop. And let me just inspire you with some of the really new things that people are doing.
Oh, that's fantastic. Look, if you're listening to this and you really enjoy it, don't forget, like, subscribe, amplify. Thank you so much for being on all the remote things today, Lisette.
Thank you. It's really been an honor to talk to you.